No mai, hara mai, good day and welcome everyone. My name is Craig Bleakley and I am the Safety and Risk Specialist here at ecoPortal. Awesome to have you here with us today. So welcome to the Safety Voice series, and this is created for health and safety professionals like you who want fresh thinking, practical insights on thought-provoking topics and leadership conversations that really matter. Today, we're exploring a risk that it doesn't show up on most dashboards, but it's increasingly shaping how people experience work, and that topic is loneliness. We tend to think of loneliness as a personal issue, something often outside the scope of traditional health and safety. But the reality is, it's becoming a systematic risk in modern workplaces, especially as the way we work continues to evolve. Interestingly, the World Health Organization has declared loneliness as a global public health concern. Incredible. Linking its impacts to something as significant as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And then at the same time, workplaces are becoming more distributed, more spread, more digital, and in many cases, more disconnected. So the question for us as leaders is, what happens when people feel invisible at work? When they don't feel seen, they don't feel supported or part of something meaningful? Because when that happens, it doesn't just affect well-being, it affects engagement, decision-making, and ultimately safety outcomes. So today, we'll unpack loneliness, not just as a human experience, but as a workplace risk that leaders need to understand, need to measure, and especially need to respond to. So moving right along, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Michele Grow is the CEO, Mental Health and Wellness at APM, and she is a recognised leader in workplace health, safety, and well-being. With more than 30 years' experience, she works with organisations across sectors to address complex workplace risks and strengthen employee well-being. Michele regularly advises leaders on mental health, workplace culture, and organisational effectiveness, and is a frequent speaker at industry conferences and forums. Michele, it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us here today. Welcome.
Kia ora, and thanks, Craig. And it's so great to see the interest in loneliness as a workplace risk. For me, it's an important topic. And today we're going to talk about why it's so important, but also it's a widespread issue. About 1 in 3 people feel lonely, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. Wanting connection is just a normal part of being human.
Absolutely.
So we've surveyed Australia and we had about 1,000 responses, and our New Zealand survey is still open. So we'll talk a little bit later about people surveying that. But there's kind of a couple of key trends that have come out of the information we've got so far. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these later. But firstly, loneliness is higher in those who spend all their time working either remotely or all of their time working in the office. So, there's a lot of talk about mandating return to work, mandating return to the office. So for those people that actually have that hybrid mix, and of course, some jobs and some roles don't permit that, but where there is that opportunity, that's the sweet spot. People who have that option of spending some time at work and some time away from work. The other one that really is, it's maybe not a surprise to some, but it will be for others, and that's that those who experience the highest levels of loneliness, they're in the under 20 age bracket. And that's closely followed by those in the 20 to 29 and the 30 to 39 age bracket. So if we're thinking this is all about older people, we're looking kind of at the wrong end of the scale. And then lastly, men and women experience loneliness equally. So it's not a gender issue.
Interesting. Loneliness has traditionally been seen as a personal or a social issue, and not necessarily something that fitted within the health and safety world. So what's changed? Why are we seeing loneliness now as a legitimate workplace risk that anyone with health and safety responsibilities needs to be really aware of and be managing better?
So I think I might just change the language slightly there, Craig, because I like to think of loneliness as a life issue. And it's not something that we can just neatly park as a personal issue or a work issue. It impacts every aspect of our lives in exactly the same way that mental health impacts every aspect of our lives. And, the focus on loneliness isn't new. In the UK, they appointed their first ever Minister for Loneliness over 8 years ago. And that was about leading a national strategy to tackle social isolation. And when you go back and read the data on that, it's interesting because they said the role was created to, and I quote, combat the sad reality of modern life. And it affects millions of people across all age groups. So, that sad reality of modern life, I like to think we have a more optimistic view. But you mentioned also the World Health Organization. So in 2023, World Health Organization declared loneliness as a global health concern. And the reason they did that is because it has a very severe and widespread impact on both the physical and mental health across every age group. And so, of course, enter the workplace. So if we talk about numbers, so roughly 1 in 3 people experience loneliness. However, about 1 in 6 experience severe loneliness. And that's if you look at the community or if you look at a workplace. So if your organization's got 1,000 employees, that's about 170 people in your workplace who are experiencing severe loneliness.
Wow.
And you mentioned, Craig, loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about feeling unseen, unsupported, or disconnected, even while you might be surrounded by people, meetings, messages, all the things that are going on in the workplace. And in a workplace today, loneliness often hides behind competence. So what it might look like the high performer who never asks for help. It might look like the leader who carries everything themselves. Or it might look like an employee who shows up every day, but they're slowly withdrawing. And, while loneliness can feel personal, the impact is organisational. It shapes decision-making, it increases risk, it weakens resilience, and it kind of quietly behind the scenes erodes engagement, it erodes safety, and it erodes well-being. And that's long before people, raise their hand or take leave. And I think in the workplace, one of the things that makes loneliness so dangerous at work isn't that it exists, but that it's easy to miss. It's easy to normalise, and it's kind of easy to go, that's not our role, it's a personal issue. And so I think that's why it does come to your early point. This is about leadership.
The 1 in 6 that suffer severe loneliness is incredible stat to me. I'm going to go off script straight away, Michele, but this is just triggered a really interesting question in that of those 1 in 6, a number of those won't feel lonely to have anything to do with their work environment. But how will that loneliness in my personal life manifest itself in my workplace environment? And are there anything specifically we should be looking out to? Because that's a crazy stat. Knowing that it's that proficient.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it, and you're absolutely right. In the same way that someone who's experiencing stress doesn't mean the stress has been caused by the workplace, loneliness is exactly the same. It's not about where it comes from, and sometimes things come from multiple places. So if you go searching online, you'll find articles that outline all kinds of different types of loneliness. One article said there's 12 different kinds of loneliness, 7 different kinds. Most commonly, there's 3. So the 3 are emotional loneliness, which is where you're missing a close bond. The second is like social loneliness, where you just don't have a network or a wide network. And then the third is kind of existential loneliness. It's where you're feeling fundamentally separate from the world around you. But actually where it comes from, what the cause, what type of loneliness are all academic. I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about why organisations have to take it seriously and what the health implications are. And I think once we get there, it will be really clear why organisations really need to think a little bit differently about it.
Okay, so you might have sort of lightly answered this already, but I'll go back to my pre-prepared question here. So when we talk about loneliness, it's easy to assume we all mean the same thing, but that's not always the case, as you've just defined. So how do we define loneliness in a workplace context to start with? And then what are the different types that leaders actually should be understanding? I think you might have a slide for this one as well.
So it's a distressing, subjective feeling of a gap between the social connections you have and the social connections you want. It's not merely about being alone, but it's often a painful sense of isolation when we're surrounded by others. And so what happens is we often talk interchangeably about loneliness and being alone. And they're two different things. So loneliness is that it is a distressing feeling. Your current relationships don't meet your social needs. It's when there's a mismatch between what you want, the quantity and quality of the relationships, and those that you have. Whereas being alone, or in some cases socially isolated, which is what happened during COVID, it's not the same as feeling lonely. And in fact, some people like to spend time alone. So being alone it's a physical state where you have fewer interactions than others. But as I said, for some people, they may enjoy that, and it's not about distress, it's about personal choice. So what helps, and when we come back to the organisational context, is about building meaningful social connection. It's about feeling connected to people in a way that's important to you. And what's important to me might be different to you, and it might be different to each of the leaders who are on this call. But I think you used the words earlier, Craig. Most people want to feel valued, they want to feel heard, and they want to feel seen. And so building connections takes time. It's not something we can turn on and turn off. And so workplaces are a community, and we all have a role in building that community. And a big part of it is about shared values. And that's one of the things that organisations like to talk a lot about.
Does being at work actually make you feel less lonely for some? And based on what you said, I could answer that myself, that yes, for some people, just being around people would make them feel less lonely. But for some, as you're saying, if there's a disconnect in that social relationships and connections, being at work will have zero effect on that loneliness factor.
And it could make it worse. So I think it depends a little bit about what's the context of that work. What is the culture of that work environment? What are the opportunities to engage with others? I think it's not just about work or not work. It's about what does that work environment look like, and how does it feed into your individual needs.
Now, you mentioned COVID before, and that was a real trigger, I'm sure, for some people in this space. So people associate loneliness with the rise of remote and hybrid work, which really came to the forefront after the pandemic. But is that assumption accurate? And are people who are physically distant from their workplace more likely to feel lonely? Or does being in the workplace every day not necessarily guarantee a stronger sense of connection? You've really touched on this, but it'd be good to get a really clear answer on this one, because I'm sure a lot of us are thinking about this exact point.
Yeah, and look, I think loneliness is not I am lonely or I'm not lonely. So our Assure business, when we look at the data that we've got so far, and recognising we're still collecting New Zealand data, the UCLA loneliness scale has 3 questions. And the 3 questions about how often people feel left out, how often they feel isolated from others, and how often they felt a lack of companionship. And so across all of the responses so far, 57% of people have said they felt left out often or some of the time. 63% said they felt isolated from others often or some of the time. And 60% said they felt a lack of companionship often or some of the time. So I think that's often or some of the time, not all of the time. And so there's different components that come in here. Now, COVID, or somebody might have a family member that moves, or a partner goes away for an amount of time. There is a sense of loneliness often of not being with those people, not seeing those people. That is quite different to the ongoing chronic and distressing loneliness. But they are real feelings, and they are real feelings that will have an impact on the workplace. And we'll talk about that shortly. I think we also want to be careful that we don't just relate loneliness to one factor, such as being at work or not being at work, because we've got to put in there the environment at work, the relationships at work. So I think it's a multi-factor. I'd love to give a really simple answer to that, but it's kind of a multi-factor approach.
Yep. From a health and safety perspective, so let's really look at the real world of the majority of our people on the call today that have health and safety responsibilities at their workplace. So from a health and safety perspective, what are the real risks of loneliness? And how does it influence things like decision-making or risk perception, or even a willingness to speak up? And then I suppose further down the line, how can it escalate into more serious mental health problems?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Craig. And this, for me, I think comes to the heart of why the World Health Organization declared loneliness a global health concern. So I just mentioned, we might all experience loneliness from time to time. That's part of the general cycle of life. But it's when we get to that loneliness that lasts, that's when it starts to become harmful to our well-being. Now, there's a lot of reasons why organisations need to take this seriously. So apart from the concern for the welfare and well-being of your people, the workplace is significant. And you can see here's all the different ways that loneliness can impact in the workplace. So it increases absenteeism, it increases or impacts people's productivity, generally to the negative. It threatens business success because my primary focus and attention is not on my role. It has an impact on culture. It impacts the way we collaborate. It impacts our physical health and our mental health. So this is just, I guess, a small snapshot. And I could probably do 5 circles like this with all the different reasons why organizations should take it seriously. But, this is just to say the impact can be significant. And if we then go forward and look at, well, why is that? And the reason for that is because the health implications are significant. So when we start talking about the health implications, there's a whole bunch of things that happen when we have that ongoing or lasting loneliness. So there is increased risk of early death, increased cardiovascular and physiological stress, increased mental health impact, increased cognitive decline, impaired sleep, behaviour risks and functional health. So the highest scores are in industries like construction and engineering, banking and finance, hospitals and healthcare, professional services and insurance. Now, some of those roles are roles where people are on site the whole time, construction, hospitals, healthcare, and they're often working unfriendly shifts, and they may well be working alone. But I think if you are working in one of those industries, then that's one where we want to, look a little bit more closely. And then the last one I thought I would share is about living arrangements. So again, people living alone, it depends on whether you live alone by choice or not by choice, but probably no real surprise that those living alone have a higher level of loneliness. But equally, those who live with a flatmate or others are also experiencing loneliness. So the fact that there are people around you doesn't necessarily change the fact that you might still experience loneliness. Well, one of the things that's come from the Ending Loneliness, they did some data where they looked at whether people lived in rural locations or metropolitan locations. There is a difference, but it's not as much as you would think. So 1 in 3 of people living in metro locations, 1 in 3.5 for those living in rural locations. There's a couple of issues with FIFO work. It's not just about you, but you are away from all of your normal supports. So you're away from family. Not only are you away from family, but while you're away, you are potentially missing key events for your children, for your partner, for your family. When you come back, you're trying to fit everything into these periods of time. So that is one kind of work where, thinking about what you can do, how you can do things differently to try to mitigate that. You can't take it away because the sheer nature of the work means it's going to be prevalent. And when I talked before about that, the emotional loneliness, that lack of, missing a close bond, but also the social component. You're very connected with the people you're working with, but your wider network is not there.
Just touching a little bit back on, just to finish off this particular question, if I am a health and safety leader at my workplace, and I have a standard workplace, I don't know, if there is such a thing, but what signals should I be looking for as a leader, whether a people leader or just a health and safety leader that has wider responsibilities? Should I be looking for to those small, maybe not obvious signals or things to discover that may provide some insights into an individual's world that I may need to be providing or wrapping some extra support around them?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because unlike someone with a cold or something else, there aren't this set of symptoms. And even more interesting is that 1 in 2 people who are lonely say they are too embarrassed to admit it and that they will actively try to conceal their loneliness. That's tricky.
Wow.
If you're the workplace.
Actively try and conceal it.
Actively. So there is a level of stigma that sits out there around loneliness. And there's some really interesting, there's a lot of perceptions and misconceptions about loneliness. And again, this is from the understanding, ending loneliness together. So almost 1 in 2 people would say people who are lonely, they would describe them as having negative traits. It's completely untrue, but that's how people think about things. 1 in 4 people tend to think that people who are lonely are a little bit less worthy than people who are not less lonely. 1 in 10 people start to think that actually there's something wrong with people who are feeling. So you can see there's all these perceptions and misperceptions and misconceptions out there about that. So it's not surprising. And it's a little bit like mental health. While that is improving, there's still a long way to go about the stigma. And loneliness carries a stigma in the same way. So one of the best things that organisations can do is actually have conversations with people. It's coming back to that building, meaningful connections, because, the difference is how you care for employee wellbeing. And those employers who are doing something are already ahead of those employers who are doing nothing. And it's not you need to go and invest a big, truck of money in doing something. It's often the simpler components about raising awareness, having the conversations. And I'll talk in a bit about some of the things organisations can do that are helpful and maybe a few things that perhaps are a little bit less helpful.
Yeah, perfect. So to what extent is loneliness a leadership issue? What role do leaders play, either intentionally or unintentionally, in either reducing or reinforcing disconnection at work?
So the one thing about leaders that I think most organisations do is we underestimate the impact that leaders have. So leaders can have a very positive impact. They can also have a less positive impact. And they are probably one of the, key planks in the health of an organisation, in, why people stay, why people go, why productivity is higher or not higher, the general health of the workplace. That comes to, and I'm saying leaders because I think that's leaders across every single level. Now, at that senior level, I think it's about setting the tone and setting the conversation. So if I think about some of the organisations we work with who are doing something, if I come back to doing something is better than doing nothing, they're typically doing a mix of things. And most of them are all about destigmatizing loneliness. So that bit about, recognising that people will actually try to conceal it. So you can do things like provide resources around loneliness. So make sure it's part of the conversation. One of the most powerful things leaders can do is share a personal story. And this is exactly the same if you want someone to use your EAP, having someone say, look, when my mother passed away, that was a very difficult period of grief. I reached out. That has an incredible impact. So leaders that might share a personal story about loneliness. Promoting avenues of support. So like your peer support networks or your employee assistance programs. And most organisations have got some avenues of support. And then there are a number of events across the year that focus on loneliness. So for those in Australia, Loneliness Awareness Week is held in August each year, and it brings up a lot of conversation, a lot of activities, in the same way that people now follow Are You OK Day or World Mental Health Day. So just getting it as part of your conversation. So that's kind of at that higher leadership level. I think when you come down to what works and what doesn't work, it's probably a little bit more basic. And again, it's not really about we've got to pay to put programs in. It's actually about people behaviour, and it's that what is it we need to do as a workplace or as a team or as a site to really build and support meaningful social connection. So the kinds of things that work, it's about creating a sense of belonging part of what everyone does. It's not what's my role, what's your role, what's the next one. How do we make creating that sense of belonging part of what everyone does? I mentioned promoting some of the other services you have, your employee assistance program, your peer support program. That is a great thing to do. However, we want to make sure that we're not saying, well, go chat with the EAP, and that's a substitute for my organisation having to take any action. So it's not an alternative, it's an as well as. One of the things we've seen people do quite effectively is, people often run training on things like having difficult conversations. So rather than difficult conversations, running a session on how to have a meaningful conversation or a connecting conversation. And particularly some workforces have workers who don't often engage a lot. And I think about audit teams. They come in, they work very much with data. The nature of their work is not engaging with other people all the time. Whereas if you're a professional athlete, you're engaging with people all the time. Doesn't mean one of those is better or not better, but just the nature of work means that people may or may not be engaging. So that helping people to know, well, what is a meaningful conversation? What is a connecting conversation? And then again, I think that don't just leave it at your senior leaders, bring it down a level, because leaders have a big impact, positive and negative.
Should loneliness appear on an organisation's psychosocial risk register?
It's a great question. And one of the challenges for risk registers and other is, can you measure it? So is it a risk in the workplace? Yes. Can you measure it, or can you measure it effectively? I think what you can measure is the opposite of that. Can you measure the degree to which meaningful conversations take place? Can you measure the alternative of what you do have rather than what you can't see? And look, across Australia and many countries around the world, Australia has legislated it in some states, but psychosocial risk is becoming increasingly important, and to be honest, rightly so. But I think we've got to be careful of just putting something on a risk register, but then not being able to measure it in a way that's helpful. But absolutely, I think where Trish is going is exactly the right way, thinking about how we think about measuring what good looks like.
So we've seen the industry slide, but is there an overall question? Are you seeing particular industries or roles or ways of working where loneliness is more prevalent or, maybe more impactful? Are there any patterns that are emerging from the work that you're doing all day, every day, with the organisations that you're working with?
There are a couple, and it's probably less about role because, Craig, you might be in the same role that I'm in, but we have quite a different experience because we have a different sphere that we live and work in. So, we can't just narrow it down to a role or not a role. One of the things we do is we do psychometric assessment for people in specific roles. And I'll give you an example that I think is a really obvious one. We do assessment for expeditioners who are going to the Antarctic. And so that's a really clear role. Someone who's going for 9 months to a very severe environment. There are very few things there. So, of course, you want to have some understanding of whether people have got the right internal capabilities to manage that. Now, you may, if you've got people going into roles, FIFO is one of those, or people going on remote deployments, we're actually doing that kind of assessment up front. Now, it doesn't mean somebody does or doesn't go, but it might mean that you provide different support to person A than you provide to person B to help them to be successful. So I think there's some of those factors that that come into play around, how do things work. The other question that we asked, so we asked the UCLA 3 questions, but then we asked some demographic information. One of the questions we asked was whether people identified themselves as being an extrovert or whether they identified as being an introvert or whether they weren't sure. Now, some of the people on this call will be familiar with the big 5 personality traits. Now, extroversion, introversion is one of those. So, and of course, we did see a higher level of experienced loneliness in those who identify as an introvert rather than those who identify as an extrovert. But one of the things we do know is that people who can be very engaging, very look like they're out there, actually that is a front, and they are quite introverted in their natural form of working. So I think you've got to go deeper than what's the job or what's the industry or and start looking at the human being that's in that mix.
We've talked about how there's no shortage of initiatives aimed at improving connections, from the wellbeing programs talked about or team building activities. Who doesn't love those? But hey, what actually works, Michele, in your eyes, when it comes to addressing loneliness? And I suppose just as importantly, what have you seen or experienced that tends to miss the mark, maybe well-intentioned, but either doesn't work or maybe even causes more harm than good?
So why don't I start with some of those things that don't work? So I think the first one, there's a lot of myths out there. So making sure that you're avoiding those myths. So, things like, well, it's actually pretty easy to make friends, or loneliness only impacts older people, or people who are lonely are a bit of a burden, or there's something wrong with people who are like all of those things are incorrect. So I think the first thing is avoiding those myths and getting a little bit of fact into the conversation. And that might just be that organisations then, on the positive, they start team meetings with whether it's a mental health fun fact or a loneliness fun fact or a well-being fun fact, just making those things part of everyday conversation rather than, as you said, that one-off or that mandatory activity. And actually, on the mandatory activities, it often makes it more difficult for some because my choice and control and agency has now been taken away. So not only did I not want to do it, I'm forced to do something I really don't want to do. So that's potentially going to have me withdraw more. And we're all familiar with people. I have to do this. So interestingly, that's the day a number of people are unwell or something has come up or something. All that is it's a reaction that I feel safe to make because I really don't feel safe to have to engage in whatever it is. I think the other one is around digital. Now, we live in a digital world, okay? So there's no avoiding that we live in a digital world. But there's a few things, and I can see somebody's asked a question about are there symptoms? Unfortunately, no, but there are a few things that you might look out for, and these could be indicative of many things. So it's not that's a symptom of loneliness, but people who feel lonely tend to engage a little bit less in physical activity. Mm-hmm. They're much more likely to have social media addiction, not just occasionally, but social media. So watching how much time they're on social media. They are more than 5 times more likely to have poor well-being. So someone who is unwell often at work or higher absence at work doesn't mean they're lonely, but it does mean maybe there's a conversation with how that person's traveling. Maybe there's a conversation about their well-being. Maybe there's a conversation about how we can do things. So, digital connection can be good, but only if it's supported by human connection. Because, last time I looked, 100% of employees in workplaces were human beings. And so that's what we need to be thinking about. We're dealing with humans, and humans are not programmable. So how do we make things human?
Great answer, Michele. That's fascinating. Hey, it's been an incredibly important and very, very thought-provoking conversation so far. I think for many of us, this has really, reframed loneliness from being something personal to something we need to actively consider as part of our safety and leadership responsibilities. To what extent is social media responsible for increasing feelings of loneliness, despite these platforms claiming they're actually for connecting people? I've got 3,000 Facebook friends. I must be the most popular man in the world, where reality is I sit alone at my desk all night.
Counting likes, is life what I see on social media? Look, I think media and social media play an important role, but they can also be incredibly damaging. And leave aside loneliness, what they can do is add significantly to generalized anxiety. So if you look for the moment at people, they may be concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. If we look at events like the very tragic events that happened at Bondi in December last year, people get to a point where they actually can't stop watching the media. Now, that's very dangerous and very damaging for young children, but equally so for adults. So I think rather than commenting on specifically how that impacts loneliness, it impacts our mental health, and it impacts we start to believe that everything we see. Now, there was a survey, I can't quite remember who conducted it recently, but I can certainly find it if it's of interest, where a high percentage of people said, because there's a lot of conversation currently about AI, that there was a very high percentage of people who said that they would be very open to engaging in a relationship with a bot, because that would be one of the ways of them dealing with loneliness. Now, I find that beyond intriguing, because, of course, it's not real. And we also know there's very significant risks on, the use of AI in mental health. And actually, this is someone saying, I do feel lonely, but I'm quite happy to engage. Now, there are 1 or 2 platforms that actually promote exactly that. We're an alternative to loneliness. Now, I think once we start going there, that's a very dangerous place to be. So I think coming back to that, does that contribute? Very likely. I don't have any data that indicates that, other than that we know that people who are lonely are much more likely to have a social media addiction and struggle to step away. But it informs our view rather than fact and reality informing our view. And that's not always helpful.
No. Do the statistics that we've presented, or your experience in this industry for so many years, do they change by culture or by ethnicity?
We didn't ask in the Australian survey about ethnicity, but in the New Zealand survey we have, we've actually asked whether people identify as Asian, Maori, Pacific, etc., because we're interested in that. There's no real data, but one of the things that you do know is culturally, families behave very differently. So in some cultures, the world of the extended family and, the grandparents being a key part of every day and the village environment, versus others where they live completely remotely from their family. Their family might be remote, they don't see them. They are factors. I can't say, I don't have any evidence or data that says, one is more than the other, but they are factors, because they are factors in where's my social network, where do I have support, who engages. Now, for some people, they might actually sound kind of like a little bit less family, but it's a factor.
In terms of, as hybrid and remote work continues to evolve, what should organizations be doing now to prevent loneliness in those environments? So maybe there's no symptoms, the leaders are happy or haven't been advised, but they want to be really proactive. What should I be doing as a safety leader now to really set myself up for success?
I think the first thing is, can a role be done in a hybrid capacity or can it not? So, for example, if you are a nurse in a hospital, then you don't really have that option. So I think you need to be able to pull out what are the roles that actually doesn't work that way. If I work in a coffee shop, I need to be there to make the coffee, versus those that can. And in either case, giving people choice and agency is what helps. So what we think is behind that factor is it's about me having agency over that decision. It suits me. Now, in my own organisation during COVID, we had a couple of people that came to the office every single day. And that was a preference for them. It met with their own needs. So we had to make sure that people were safe and had all of those things around them, whereas most people, it never even crossed their minds. So people need to have that choice and control and having agency over what happens. That's number one. And that's why I think there's been such pushback over things like organisations mandating you must be back at work. Now, I might be quite happy to come back at work, but the fact that I've been told to come back to work, I'm not so happy with. So I've just lost any agency and control that I had over that. So I think the first thing is understand what you can do, and then where can you give people choice over how that works. Because it might just be, it works better for me if I could start half an hour earlier and finish half an hour earlier. That might be enough to give me some control, and that lets me do other things in my life that helps me stay connected. So I think it's about avoiding that all or nothing. I read in this morning's paper, there are still organisations who are doing that. You must all be back in the office because whatever the because is. But that's where it becomes quite challenging. And I think the other thing is just having more conversations with people, conversations with leaders. You can align performance with other factors. What does the highest performing people look like? If you've got a big enough cohort, what's different about those that are doing extremely well to those that aren't? In the same way, somebody asked before about psychosocial risk. Where is your lowest risk? Where's your highest? Are there any common factors in there? But I think that just mandating something for the sake of something without understanding the importance of people having control.
Can a person be lonely but happy about it? Can they coexist? Or is loneliness the negative? It's a negative connotation, and so you can't be lonely and happy. You would just be happy, I guess.
Yeah, and I would come back to, I think I mentioned earlier, the distinction between loneliness and being alone, and that we often use them interchangeably. So loneliness is a distressing feeling. So I would say, can somebody be lonely and happy? No. Can somebody be alone and happy? Yes. So, being alone or being socially isolated, people enjoy that. And so, and people will often say, I just had a day out to myself on the weekend. It was fantastic. Normally my life's chaotic. I'm quite happy with that, but I just needed this amount of time. So I think I would just make that distinction between loneliness and being alone. Being alone and happy, absolutely. And I think there's probably quite a few people who fall into that category. And some of us probably all have little elements of that.
Well, 5 minutes to go. I think I'm going to call that a wrap. Thank you again, Michele, for sharing your very important time and expertise. Any final thoughts to leave us with, Michele?
Look, probably one. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think it's about understanding and supporting loneliness that makes a difference. And loneliness at work isn't a soft issue. It's a leadership issue that has real human and real organisational consequences. And if we think about it through that lens, I think that's that helps people to think about what they can and should do.
If this topic is really touch the flame to them, create a bit of a light bulb moment for them, how can they get in touch with you to have a bit more of a personal conversation?
Absolutely. And look, I'd welcome anyone to reach out. Look, probably two ways. Either connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message, or send me an email. And we also mentioned that we're publishing an insights report. If you would like to have a copy of that when it's published, just send me an email and we'll make sure that it gets to you as soon as it's been finalised.
Wonderful. Thank you. I hope we're leaving today with some really useful insights on how to build safer, more connected and more supportive workplaces. Until next time, take care, stay safe, ka kite anō.
Thank you for listening to safetyCast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues, because safety knowledge is meant to be shared. Stay safe, stay engaged, and be sure to catch our next episode for more expert insights. See you then.